Welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling a conflict
Okay.
that I think gets overlooked a lot.
Right.
The War of 1812.
The War of 1812.
We've got articles and videos and
Hurrah.
even some firsthand accounts from back then
That's awesome.
to try to understand this war.
Okay.
Our mission today is to really figure out why this war is still relevant,
I like it.
even now in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And we're going to be looking at this question.
Okay.
If the war officially ended in December 1814,
Mm-hmm.
how is there a major U.S. victory afterwards?
Interesting.
Just hold on to that thought for now.
Okay.
But first, let's go back to the early 1800s.
Right.
Set the stage here.
Okay.
What lit the fuse on this conflict?
It is interesting how people call it a forgotten conflict.
Right.
That it was a pivotal moment for the U.S.
Yeah,
It really shaped the country and the future.
absolutely.
To understand this war,
Great.
we need to imagine a young United States
Okay.
still finding its footing
Mhm.
after the revolution.
Right.
They're trying to establish themselves globally,
Yeah.
but there's this constant tension with Great Britain.
So it wasn't just one thing
No, not at all.
that led to the war.
There were several factors at play.
Like what?
Well, one major point of contention was this thing called impressment.
Impressment.
Yeah, so British naval ships would stop American vessels.
Okay.
And they would basically kidnap American sailors
Wow.
and force them to serve in the British Navy.
So I've heard this,
Yeah.
but some of these sailors were actually British deserters
Right.
who had kind of sought refuge on these ships.
That's a good point.
How do we think about that?
It was complex.
Yeah.
Determining true nationality was a challenge back then, and the
Yeah.
British didn't really seem to care.
Right.
They just took whoever they needed,
Wow.
and that made Americans mad.
Yeah, I bet.
It felt like a violation of their sovereignty.
The world was so different back then.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's hard to imagine something like that happening today.
I know, right?
Besides impressment,
Yeah.
what else was pushing the U.S. and Great Britain
Okay.
closer to war?
Remember that Europe was in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Both the British and the French put restrictions on neutral trade,
Okay.
hoping to hurt the other side's economies.
Mhm.
The British orders in council
Okay.
barred American ships from trading with France
Gotcha.
or French colonies,
Okay.
and this had a big impact
Yeah.
on American merchants.
Right.
It added to this growing resentment against Britain.
So the U.S. is trying to stay neutral,
Yeah,
but their economy's taken a hit.
exactly.
They're caught in the middle.
Yeah, they're in a tough spot.
But I thought at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars,
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. was benefiting from trading with both sides.
Well, that's true.
Couldn't they have waited to join the war?
It's possible
Other
they
than-
did profit in the early years of the war,
Right.
but as the war went on, both sides became more aggressive
Okay.
with their trade restrictions.
Right.
It made it almost impossible for the
Mhm.
U.S. to stay neutral.
Gotcha.
Plus, there was also tension
Right.
on the western frontier.
Let me guess.
Yeah,
The British were involved there too.
you got it.
Okay.
American settlers were moving westward,
Right.
and this led to conflict with Native American tribes.
Mhm.
The British saw this as an opportunity to
Oh.
stop American expansion
Right.
and maintain their influence in North America.
Wow.
So they started supporting these tribes,
Really?
which further escalated tensions.
So we've got impressment,
Yeah,
trade restrictions, conflict on the frontier.
exactly.
Sounds like a powder keg
It really does.
ready to explode.
Yeah.
Was there like one specific thing
Well,
that finally started the war?
in the U.S., there was this group in Congress
Okay.
called the War Hawks.
The Warhawks.
Yeah, figures like Henry Clay
Yeah.
and John C. Calhoun. They were really pushing for war.
Okay.
They felt that Great Britain didn't respect the United States.
Interesting.
They thought the only way to be independent
Mhm.
was through a military victory.
A decisive victory.
Yeah,
Wow.
they wanted to prove themselves
Right.
on the world stage.
Okay.
So yeah, there was a lot going on.
A lot of tension
Yeah.
building up to this one.
Exactly.
So these Warhawks, they really pushed the U.S. into a war.
Yeah, it was a gamble for sure.
It seems like it.
The U.S. military was still new
Right.
compared to Great Britain
Yeah.
and their navy.
Yeah.
Well, it was no match for the British fleet.
So the U.S. was in for a tough fight.
Yeah, the early part of the war was rough.
In what way?
Well, the British imposed a naval blockade
Okay.
along the American coast.
A blockade.
Yeah.
What did that do?
It really hurt American trade.
Okay.
Ships couldn't get in or out of ports.
Wow.
It was bad for the U.S. economy.
I bet that blockade affected more than just ships, though.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What kinds of goods were impacted?
All kinds of things.
Like what?
Everything got scarce.
Wow.
Prices went way up.
Really?
Farmers couldn't export their crops.
Oh, wow.
Some of them went bankrupt.
That's terrible.
And manufactured goods from Europe. They
Yeah.
were disrupted too.
Oh, wow.
It was tough.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Americans had to rely on domestic goods,
Okay.
which were more expensive
Wow.
or just not as good.
It was a test for the U.S.
It really was.
And then on top of that,
Yeah.
the British burned Washington, D.C.
In 1814, yeah,
That must have been a huge blow.
it was shocking.
Yeah.
British forces marched on Washington and
Yeah.
set fire to government buildings.
Like the White House.
the White House,
Wow.
the Capitol.
Okay.
It was a symbolic victory
Yeah.
for the British,
Right.
but it had a big impact on Americans.
It must have been devastating.
Yeah.
But did it also unify them
You're right.
against a common enemy?
The burning of Washington was a turning point.
Okay.
It made Americans want to defeat the British.
Okay.
And they actually had some big victories that changed the course of the war.
Like what?
Well, one was the Battle of Lake Erie
The Battle of Lake Erie.
in 1813.
Okay.
It was a big win for the U.S. Navy.
Okay.
Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry led the Americans.
Okay.
They defeated the British fleet.
Wow.
This gave the U.S. control of the Great Lakes.
So it was a strategic victory.
Exactly.
It wasn't just about the ships.
Right.
It was about controlling the lakes.
It meant controlling supply lines
Okay.
and communication routes.
So it helped the U.S. and the West.
Exactly. And it made the British focus their efforts elsewhere.
And speaking of focusing efforts,
Yeah,
what about the Battle of New Orleans?
that's a famous one.
Right.
It was a huge American victory.
Okay.
General Andrew Jackson led the Americans.
Andrew Jackson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
It happened after the war was officially over. They'd
Yeah.
been fighting after the war ended.
The Treaty of Ghent had already been signed.
But they didn't know that.
No news traveled slowly back then.
Right, of course.
So they fought this battle.
Even though the war was over.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's a funny story,
It is.
but it had big consequences.
Okay, like what?
It boosted morale in the U.S.,
All right.
and it made Andrew Jackson a hero.
The hero.
It helped him become president later on.
Wow.
So it's an important battle,
Yeah, it sounds like it.
even though it happened after the war.
So the war is over.
Yeah.
The U.S. is feeling good. What were the lasting impact?
The War of 1812 had a big impact.
Okay.
It unified the country
Okay.
and gave them an identity.
So it was like a coming-of-age moment.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
It showed the world that the U.S. was a real power.
A force to be reckoned with.
Exactly.
Right.
They could defend themselves,
Okay.
even against Great Britain.
But it wasn't just about pride.
No, there were economic effects, too. All right, we talked about the trade restrictions.
Yeah.
Did the war change the economy in unexpected ways?
Yeah, for sure.
Like,
The war forced the U.S. to become more self-sufficient. They
Alright.
couldn't trade as much,
Right.
so they had to make their own goods.
I see.
This led to growth in manufacturing,
Okay.
especially in textiles.
Okay.
Things that they used to import from Britain.
So the war helped American industry.
It did.
How did that change the U.S. economy long term?
It helped start the Industrial Revolution in America.
Wow.
They needed domestic production,
Right.
so they invested in new technology.
I see.
Factories were built,
Okay.
and the U.S. started to become an industrial nation.
So it was a turning point.
It really was.
What about the Native Americans who had sided with the British?
It was bad for them.
How so?
They thought the British would help them
Okay.
stop American expansion.
Right.
But when the British lost,
Yeah.
they lost their ally.
Oh, wow.
They faced even more pressure from settlers.
That's sad.
It's a tragic part of American history. Yeah, it's important to remember their stories.
Absolutely.
But let's bring it back to today.
Okay.
How does this war relate to the 21st century?
Right. We promised to talk about that.
Yeah. Okay, I'm listening.
This forgotten conflict.
Yeah.
It has lessons for us today.
What kind of lessons?
Well, one big one is diplomacy.
Diplomacy.
Yeah, the importance of it.
Okay.
Could the war have been avoided
Mm-hmm.
if they had just talked more?
You think so?
It's a good question to think about,
It really is.
especially today.
Yeah, how can we prevent conflicts
Exactly.
in our world today?
Communication is key.
So true.
Another lesson is about nationalism.
Nationalism.
Yeah, the war hawks.
Right.
They were really nationalistic.
They wanted war.
Exactly.
It's like they thought it was good for America,
Yeah, they might have believed that.
but it led to a lot of suffering.
War is always costly.
It makes you think about patriotism.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to be patriotic.
But blind nationalism is dangerous.
You need to be reasonable.
Right, you need to think clearly.
Not just emotional.
How do we find that balance?
Between pride and reality.
It's a tough question.
Yeah, we see it all the time.
In the news.
Exactly.
Okay.
The War of 1812 also shows
Okay.
the power of national identity.
National identity.
Yeah, the war made the U.S. stronger
Okay.
and more unified.
Like they'd gone through something together.
Exactly.
A shared experience.
Right.
It's powerful.
But national identity can be tricky.
Oh, how so?
It can unite people,
Yeah.
but it can also divide them,
Oh, I see.
especially if it makes you feel superior.
Right, like better than other countries.
Yeah, it's important to be aware of that.
That's a good point.
We need to think about how we define ourselves.
As a nation,
Exactly.
what it means to be American.
Right.
And what about the cultural legacy
Oh, yeah, that's important too.
of the War of 1812?
Remember our question from the beginning.
About the U.S. victory after the war?
The Battle of New Orleans.
Yeah,
It happened after the peace treaty.
but it's still famous.
And you know what?
Right.
That battle is connected to our national anthem.
The Star-Spangled Banner
Yeah, Francis Scott Key saw the American flag.
at Fort McHenry.
During the bombardment,
Wow.
he was inspired to write the song.
That's amazing.
A song from a conflict.
Can become so important.
It's a symbol of resilience.
It gives you hope.
Yeah, even in tough times.
The War of 1812 may be forgotten,
Yeah,
but it shaped America,
its identity,
its values.
even its music.
Well, there you have it, folks.
That was a deep dive.
We've learned about the War of 1812,
Its causes,
its battles,
its impacts,
and how it's still relevant.
even today.
Hopefully you have a new perspective.
It's an important part of history.
Think about this question.
Okay.
If the War of 1812 was a second war of independence, what does that say about America?
Its relationship with power
Its place in the world?
and how it has changed.
It's something to ponder.
It's definitely.
Thanks for joining us.
It was fun.
Until next time,
Keep learning.
keep exploring.